morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Alex Ferguson. I have the very great privilege of being the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, and it's in that capacity that I offer you all a very warm welcome here to Holyrood this morning. I know that some of you have travelled quite a long way to be here, and for that we are very, very grateful. It makes the occasion all the more special, as does two very special people I would like to mention, who are my two predecessors as presiding officer, Sir David Steele and George Reid, both of whom will be taking part in later events of the morning. But we're very, very delighted to have them here as well. I imagine that for many of you this may well be your first visit to the Scottish Parliament. Indeed, for some it might be your first visit to Edinburgh. So for those whose first visit this is, I hope you manage to take the opportunity to get to know the Parliament, to get to know its openness and its accessibility, and also to see this wonderful city of Edinburgh at what looks like being its sunniest best today. All that, of course, is for later. And for now, we get straight down to business with the opening of this Scottish Diaspora Forum. The theme of today's event, A Future from Our Past, is, I think, a very prescient one. We sit here today in this wonderful debating chamber of Scotland's national parliament in the same year that we mark the 250th anniversary of the birth of Robert Burns, our year of homecoming. And it's also the same year that we mark the 10th anniversary of our Scottish Parliament, a decade of devolution. And these two very different anniversaries have conspired to ensure that this year, above all others, it's one in which we Scots have taken time to reflect on and indeed to celebrate our past. But perhaps more importantly, we're also looking forward. We're looking ahead at how we want this Parliament and indeed this country to evolve and to develop, and at how we can best draw upon our rich history and culture in going forward. And that's why events such as today's forum are so important. Any opportunity that brings together politicians, academics, entrepreneurs, the media, and our many, many international friends are very important. Because Scotland's culture and Scotland's identity is about much more than just the 5 million Scots who live here today. How Scotland develops, Scotland's place in the world, will be shaped not only by those living here, or indeed by those of us here in Parliament or government, but by the many millions of people with Scottish ancestry across the globe. By you, by our diaspora, estimated to be as many as 30 to 40 million, and I'm told by some that there are probably the same number again who would very much like to be part of that diaspora. Now, you have, of course, played a strong role in determining how Scotland is viewed and promoted beyond these shores and in how it moves forward. And of course we have the very strongest of foundations on which to build. Scotland, its history, its clans, its inventors, its writers and its scientists are already very well known the world over. Almost anywhere across the globe, if you tell someone you're a Scot, you'll receive a warm smile, a warmer welcome, and probably an anecdote or three about a distant cousin or uncle of Scottish descent. Other countries round the globe can only look on in envy at such an instantly recognised brand. So with that level of interest and goodwill out there, we can surely only be pushing at an open door, especially in this year of homecoming. Your challenge today is to look at how we can harness and capitalise on that interest and goodwill to ensure that Scotland, its values and its culture can continue to play a strong role in this world of the 21st century. Now, you'll hear this morning from a number of very well-informed and highly respected speakers on the theme, and later this morning through the question and answer sessions, you'll have the opportunity to contribute your own views. Now, like any other parliamentary facility, this chamber can perhaps seem to some slightly daunting and intimidating. But please remember that this is your Parliament, and we want to hear your voices, your thoughts and your views later on today, particularly during the question and answer sessions. Again, I would thank you all for coming here today from wherever you've come from. This forum can only be as good as you make it, and I wish you all a most enjoyable and a productive morning. Thank you. I now have great pleasure in inviting the Minister for Culture, External Affairs and the Constitution, Michael Russell, MSP, to get us off to a good start. Michael.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is a strange experience, you and I think the two members of the Scottish Parliament who are present, me standing here and speaking in this way. But I'm grateful to you and to your predecessors, David Steele and George Reid, for the hard work that has been put into the organisation of this event, and also to the members of the Advisory Board, and particularly Kirsty McGregor, for making it happen. Now, you would all have had to be in hiding not to be aware that 2009 is the year of homecoming. This year, of course, and you do not need reminded of this, but I shall remind you just for a last time, this is the 250th anniversary of the birth of Robert Burns. And in celebrating that, Scotland has issued an open invitation to all those with a connection to this country, to those who just love the country, to those who know something about it and those who want to know something about it, to come home and join in the celebrations. Now, alongside one of the highest profile homecoming events being held this weekend, the gathering just across there, we have this Diaspora Forum, an event which, while somewhat lower key, is of great importance in order to discuss and debate how Scotland can strengthen ties with the diaspora and how we can create the mutually beneficial relationship that will serve both of us well and serve Scotland even better. And today's event recognises two things. It recognises that one of this small country's greatest strengths is its people. And it recognises that the time for reconciliation has come. Time to reconcile who we were with who we are. Time to reconcile who the world thinks we were with what we are actually doing. To reconcile reality and history, and sometimes to reconcile reality and myth. And to reveal to the world a new Scotland, at ease with itself and its past. But it would be presumptuous for any government of Scotland to speak on behalf of that diaspora. Because there are not just 5 million Scots. There are, as the presiding officer has said, between 40 and perhaps 60 million Scots who claim descent from this country and who live worldwide. And there are probably the same number again who claim an affinity with Scotland, who one might call aspirant Scots, apprentice Scots, people who want to be Scottish and have a great affection for what the Canadian author Frederick Niven called this kingdom of the mind, this place of imagination, this place which they would like to call home. Now, many of you have those connections of one sort or another, and I have experienced them myself in the two ministerial roles that I've covered since 2007 in my travels overseas. I could give you snapshots from a whole range of places, and my colleagues will give you them from Australia, from New Zealand, from South America, from Hong Kong, from China. I want to pick three myself from North America, which I visited 3 or 4 times in the last 2 years. And the first of them is in Winnipeg last year, at the unveiling of the memorial to the Selkirk settlers, where it was clear that there was a living connection between the people who celebrated Scotland and their past. A real connection with the hardship that the people went through, and a delight that the Scottish Government was working with a very distinguished expatriate Scot, Dennis MacLeod, to create a memorial to those settlers, and indeed to have that memorial unveiled by none other than James Douglas Hamilton, the Earl of Selkirk. And I actually assure you, going to Winnipeg with the Earl of Selkirk is like going to heaven with God. The second snapshot I would give you is in New York this April, where I took part in a photo shoot to advertise the Highland Games that are taking place here today. And I took part with a leading American athlete who is a leading American field athlete for Scots Games. And he was able to tell me in the middle of Central Park on a Sunday morning things about Highland Games that I never knew or even guessed. He had no direct relationship with Scotland, but he was passionate for the country and the way it celebrated itself. And thirdly, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, just 3 weeks ago I was at Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. And there, on an official visit on behalf of Historic Scotland, where we are lending the American National Park Service the technology to image that place, that shrine to democracy, I met the granddaughter of one of the famous Navajo code talkers, those heroes of the Second World War. And she told me that her great-grandfather was Scottish. And she bore very proudly not just her native American heritage, but her Scottish heritage as well. So throughout the world, there are as many different types of relationships with Scotland as there are people who are proud of those relationships. And it is clear that Scotland has a unique and instantly recognisable presence anywhere in the world. And I want to pay tribute, first of all, to those members, thousands of members, of the St Andrews, Burns, Caledonian and Clan societies, many of whom will be in Holyrood Park today, for the work that they have done in good years and in bad to keep that flame alive. They have wanted to see Scotland recognised and celebrated at a time when even people in Scotland themselves did not necessarily want that. They deserve our thanks and our tribute. But of course, times move on. In the age of electronic communication, Scotland has to seize the opportunities to create dynamic virtual networks, to connect with businesses, with charities, with clubs, societies and people from all around the world, to reforge new connections and to build on the work of the past to benefit us all. Let me, for example, celebrate the work of Eddie Tate, who is here today, founder of the flourishing ScotsIn network. He himself has created a virtual network of Scots, and it's a network we can all build on. But we have to ask ourselves in an event like this some basic questions. And let me ask the most basic of all in my role as a government minister. What is the government's role or interest in engaging with the diaspora? Well, I think there are several answers to that. And the first lies in that famous phrase, small is beautiful. Small, distinct and internationally minded is even more beautiful. The World Bank has emerged as a key advocate of diaspora strategies for small nations. And they've highlighted Scotland as in the top category for potential in terms of our state of art in readiness to engage with the diaspora. The Global Scot Network has been quoted by them as an example of best practice. The Centre for Diaspora Studies, opened as part of the University of Edinburgh last year with the distinguished leadership of Tom Devine, is a world first. And our Year of Homecoming is being watched worldwide as an example of how things might be done elsewhere. So there is tremendous goodwill. There's also active participation. Our Gateway to Scotland, the Scotland.org website, is a key tool. And in the last year, it's seen a 51% increase in traffic, attracting over 800,000 individual visits. But what makes Scotland really special in these stakes and gives it the opportunity is the enduring connection that exists, the live connection. Today's activities outside these walls are an example of how live that is. That when such an event is held, the largest gathering of the clans in Scotland for at least 2 centuries, then it is something that does attract people worldwide. And with these homecoming celebrations in full force, we can focus on what we can achieve from them and the purpose that they're devoted to. And any diaspora policy that the government gets involved in has to have some distinctive aspects. It's got to focus on the cultural as well as the economic to make sure that Scotland benefits culturally and economically from all those who are connected with it. It's got to be light touch and flexible because anything else will destroy the goodwill. It's got to be long-term. It's got to recognise intangible as well as tangible benefits. It's got to understand the reciprocal nature of the relationship and the fact that you have as much to teach us and to talk to us about as we could ever talk to you about. And it's got to be open-minded about what constitutes the diaspora. And that question, of course, is the most difficult of all. Who are the diaspora? Who are the people in this room? Are you first-generation migrants, Scots living and working overseas? I can see 1 or 2 of you I know who are in that category. Are you second, third, fourth generation beyond, reconnecting with your cultural roots? Are you, and Tom Devine may mention this, as some are, the relatives of people who are not acknowledged as Scots for many generations? Are you one of the tens of millions of people around the world who cannot find the live connection, but who feel a connection of culture or emotion with the country? In all those categories, you are of value to Scotland. And what would that value bring to Scotland? Well, let me suggest what it will bring. It will bring an achievement of a better Scotland. A Scotland that's more knowledgeable about what's taking place in the world, a Scotland that's more confident about its place in the world, a Scotland that's more able to communicate in the world, and a Scotland that's more able to make links with the world. Those are all things that the diaspora can bring to Scotland. And we can see examples of how that is happening. And in recognition of the fact that we want that to happen, the Scottish Government is already collecting robust diaspora research to produce a reliable base for future policy making. We're working with partners and stakeholders across the public sector and the private sector. Scottish Enterprise, Visit Scotland, Scottish Development International, Event Scotland are all working on this. And the new Creative Scotland is committed to do so as well. We're looking at what the private sector is doing and hoping to collaborate with them. And we're talking, as today, directly with members of diaspora organisations and individuals who are active. We're collating that information, we're identifying gaps and opportunities, and we're setting in place a long-term policy that will encourage you and those you know and those you work with to make a living connection with Scotland so that it benefits you and Scotland. Now, I very much hope that I can share that in the period that I'm in this post. I know that each member of the government is committed to it, and I know each member of the government wants to reach out and be part of that process. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to hear what you've got to say today. There are officials in the Scottish Government amongst you. They're not hiding. I'm sure they'll identify themselves, and they will be listening to the debate. And I hope to join you myself later today over lunch to hear some of your conclusions. Presiding Officer, you'll recall that John Steinbeck, in a letter to Jackie Kennedy, described Scotland as a cause unwon. And it seems to me that the real role of the diaspora is to help Scotland to win its own cause. Modern Scotland, to understand what modern Scotland is, to explain modern Scotland to the world, and to blend the best of modern Scotland with the best of our tradition and history, so that hand in hand we can undertake the task which this government is engaged on, which this nation is now engaged on, in being a modern nation within a modern world, but firmly rooted in its past and confident in its future. I hope this is a successful event today. I look forward to meeting each and every one of you either at this or at the gathering later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for so ably setting the scene for us this morning. I now have great pleasure in introducing Professor Tom Devine, who's already been mentioned by the Minister. And who also mentioned the fact that he's Director of the Scottish Centre of Diaspora Studies, and he is going to give us our keynote speech this morning. He has dedicated his entire career to Scottish studies and Scottish research, and in 2001 was presented with the Royal Gold Medal by the Queen and appointed OBE in 2005 for services to Scottish history. I don't think there's anyone who is better qualified to give this particular keynote speech this morning, and I have great pleasure in inviting Professor Devine to take the podium. Tom.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer, for those generous introductory remarks. And maybe I kind of say to begin with how delighted I was to hear Mr. Russell's sentiments. He's gone, but hopefully this will be conveyed to him. I particularly liked the Scottish Government's commitment in terms of long-term, because depending on the debates and discussions we have today, the development of what we seek to aspire to in terms of the relationship between the great emigrations of the Scottish people over the centuries and this modern nation, that will take time, it will take commitment, and it will take energy. Now, one of my favourite phrases, ladies and gentlemen, is that the future is not my period. So my role in this venture is to talk about the past. The emphasis of much of the discussion that takes place later will be on the present and, obviously, the future. And I can maybe throw in some speculations at that point. But what I want to talk about essentially is the extraordinary, and I would say epic, story of the global Scottish diaspora. I want to begin, in a sense, with some generalised comments, but I then want to get into what I think is essentially an historical conundrum, an historical puzzle about the emigration process of the Scottish people, especially over recent times, and by recent times to an historian, that's the last 2, 3 or 4 centuries. The word diaspora has, in a sense, recently been, I suppose you would describe it as either corrupted or diluted. It's become almost a synonym for emigration. But if you go back to the historical root, if you like, the semantic root of the word, it does fundamentally mean scattering, dispersal. And although human mobility, international migration, has been a constant in human affairs, probably since time began, only a relatively few nations in the world, or peoples, or ethnic groups can actually claim to be truly diasporic. They certainly include in that category the Jewish people, the Irish, the sub-Saharan Africans, of course, many of whom coerced into diaspora by the monstrous nature of the slave trade in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. It probably also includes the Chinese, especially in their activities in South Asia, and the Indians, the Indian people. But it certainly does also include people from this country. I want to suggest that there are three distinctive hallmarks, and I'm thinking here comparatively, of other diasporas and of other migrations of different peoples. I want to try and pick out for you to begin with what I see as the 3 or 4 hallmarks, the distinctive features of the migrations of the Scottish people over the centuries. The first is the quite remarkable longevity, the quite remarkable time frame that we're talking about. We're talking about a process which began as early as the 13th century and has gone on for 8 centuries, with different, of course, territorial alignments, with different configurations in terms of outward movement. But it is something that's lasted almost to the present day. I mean, as late as 1981 to 1991, over that decennial census period, Scotia lost 200,000 people moving outside the UK, and that does not include people who moved to England. In the centuries, in the decades between the 1920s and the 1980s, the Scottish population only rose by 7%. England and Wales rose by 38%. That differential was a reflection of the continuing hemorrhage right through the 20th century. I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, even as far as historians are concerned, that very late movement is, in a sense, an invisible diaspora. It's been forgotten, but it's extremely important because that's where the first and second generation come from. And as Michael Russell indicated, when we talk about the diasporic process, we can be talking about anything from 8th, 9th generation through to people who actually were born in this country and now live abroad. The second hallmark is the extraordinary geographical range of this particular diasporic movement. There's a constant in it. The constant is England. And that is an enduring force in terms of destination from the early medieval period right down to the present day. Statisticians talk about the dark number, the things we don't know about in a quantitative sense. There is no bigger dark number than the migration of Scots to England. I would reckon, given the bits and pieces of evidence that I've been able to collate, that it is by far the biggest manifestation numerically of diaspora if you take that entire 7th to 8th century period. But we know very little about it, and we often forget about it. But it is extremely important. It's arguably the most constant manifestation of Scottish emigration over the long time frame that I've tried to identify for you. And then if you take the medieval and early modern period, the orientation, apart from England, is emphatically towards Europe. It's emphatically towards, as the migrations mature, it's emphatically towards Scandinavia, many of the Baltic ports. The most remarkable aspect is the great movement to Poland, to Polonia in the 17th century. We've been able to identify no less than 140 Scottish settlements of varying size right down the great valley of the River Vistula in Central Europe. We're talking probably, in that particular part of the world, an upper bound of 60,000 immigrants in the 17th century and a lower bound of about 35 to 40,000. in terms of estimates. These European migrants, many of them belong to Scotland's greatest export of the medieval and early modern period, men of violence, soldiers who established a very distinctive reputation as members of an aggressive fighting force, in massive demand during the 100 Years' War between France and England, and also equally and very emphatically during the 30 Years' War of the mid-17th century. And you find them at every level, from rank and file up to general and admiral, in forces from Russia right through the Holy Roman Empire, but especially in Scandinavia and the interior areas which emerged eventually to found the state of Poland at a later time. But they're also merchants, and particularly what we would almost call hucksters in many parts of the continent of Scottish origin. These are individuals who are operating at a very petty level of trade, but they're everywhere. William Lithgow, known as Lugless Will, because his ears were removed by two jealous brothers of a girl whom he had seduced in Lanark in the 1620s, in his, what he calls, his terrible and awful peregrinations throughout Europe for 19 years, he was finally racked by the Spanish Inquisition for being a Protestant Scot. But he went from Scotland through England into Western Europe, down through the Caucasus, and eventually into the Holy Land. And he met these small traders, these men of commerce, everywhere he went. Small in some areas, larger communities in other areas. In Gdansk, he came across the two parts of the town, demonstrated and called Scotland, with two T's rather than one T. And you can still see this map today, or a copy of it, in that very interesting National Library of Scotland exhibition on the diaspora, which is presently showing and which I had the honour to open several weeks ago. And then, of course, in the European context, there is the academic migration. 19 of the rectors of the great University of Paris, between its foundation in the early medieval period and the Reformation, were Scots. The first 5 principals of the two, first King's College and then Marischal College, Aberdeen, all had been educated abroad. The Edinburgh Medical School would not have existed in its 18th century efflorescence if it hadn't been for the long-distance connections with Leiden. We seek for origins of the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, another great historical puzzle. One explanation is this nation had been plugged into the European world of the mind for centuries before the 18th century Enlightenment. And so the intellectual intercourse flowed through these channels, these historic channels, back to the nation in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, when there were other appropriate conditions for the full flourishing of Scottish culture and of Scottish philosophy. And then the axis changes in the 17th century. Not at this point towards North America. There was only around 7,000 Scots, according to the work of my colleague David Dobson, in North America by about 1700, in the years immediately before the Union. The movement west is first towards Ulster. The Scots, in a sense, in the early 17th century, become the garrison ethnic group for James VI and I's policy of creating an Anglo-Saxon Protestant wedge between two areas of Gaelic Catholic culture, the Western Highlands and Islands, a truculent area as far as the state was concerned, and Papist Ireland. And from the very beginning, the selection was made from the southwest districts of Scotland, Ayrshire, Western Lanarkshire, Western Renfrewshire, Southern Argyll and Galloway. These were the militantly Presbyterian areas of Scotland, and they were meant to play a militant role. Ironically enough, ladies and gentlemen, The full extent of that movement to Ulster only occurs in the 1690s, with the Scottish famines of those years, when Scotland lost 15 to 20% of its population through either famine, death through famine, and the diseases associated with it, or through migration. So the way I would see Ulster is, it's in a sense stopping, it's hindering the flight across the Atlantic. And we don't actually get mass Scottish immigration to North America, both what became the USA and what was in the 18th century British North America, later Canada, until really the 1750s, 1760s. It's a last quartile of the 18th century development. But when it occurs, it's a flood. And we know the full extent of it by the representations we're seeing here in Edinburgh today of people from that background. So we're talking essentially movement, if you take the tip from the frozen wastes of northern Canada down into the, first of all, the major colonies pre-1776, Glasgow's, in a sense, still very difficult to believe its extent. Glasgow's hegemony in the Virginia and Maryland tobacco trades allows for, if you like, a thoroughfare to be created, a transportation network to be created, which allows for full-scale immigration. Then into the Caribbean area, perhaps one of the darker sides of the diasporic experience, very limited impact of Scottish educational institutions and even Presbyterian religious institutions there. But if you look at the Jamaican telephone directory today, you'll see it's packed with Scottish names. They are the descendants of the slave populations of the West Indies who took the names of their masters, their overseers, and the bookkeepers who ran those plantations. India is extremely important, not in terms of mass, because we've only been able to discover, at least for the 18th century, just around 5,000 civil servants, merchants, officers, officer-class soldiers who went there, but extremely significant in the fact that the Scots, for long periods in the 18th and into the 19th century, virtually ran the Indian Empire, especially that in Bengal, through the domination of the civil service, the writer class, if you like, the writer grade of the East India Company, and also in the developing merchant trades of the area. And South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, but never limited to empire, because we also see them by the late 19th century in Latin America, especially in areas like Uruguay and Argentina. And they're beginning also to play a role in China and also in Japan, at least at the mercantile level. So it is a remarkable story in terms of extent. It is a truly global diaspora, a truly global scattering. The last area I want to look at is scale, which is the root of the problem, it seems to me. We've been able to work out that in the mid-17th century, with the fragile materials available, that the emigration of Scottish young men between 1640 and 1660 was operating at the same level per head of population in that period as in the better-known migrations of the Victorian era. The exodus was already vast in the medieval and early modern periods. But then when we go into the modern period, it becomes even more significant. 2 million leave between 1815 to 1939. Of every 2 babies born in Scotland during that period, 1 would leave permanently, either for abroad or for England. And as I said to you in my introductory remarks, that exodus continues almost virtually to the present day. It's a diaspora which is not simply ancient, it is constantly being renewed and invigorated in a profound demographic sense. So my question is this, finally: why is it that so many people live this land? And it can't honestly be explained solely in terms of the weather, because as you can see, the weather today is absolutely beautiful. And I'm just back from the Isle of Mull, and we've had Caribbean weather up there for the last 10 days. as you can possibly see by my physical appearance. The early period is relatively easily explained. A poor country, population increase, vulnerable to famine. Of course people look outside for employment opportunity. It's almost a flight from limited opportunity. The more difficult problem is for the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, because in the very period where the Scots were moving in large numbers and voting with their feet, the nation to which they belonged was the second richest nation on earth, a nation which had undergone a process of industrial and economic transformation at a speed unequalled until Soviet Russian forced industrialization of the 1920s and early 1930s. This is what I've described in my writings as the paradox of Scottish immigration. Why? One explanation is there is one area of Scotland which is weak, vulnerable, subject to pressures of clearance, privation, famine, destitution, weakening employment opportunities, the Highlands and especially the Western Highlands and Islands. Undoubtedly, that area did contribute very substantially to the exodus of the Scottish people, especially between the 1760s and the 1850s, and more especially of all during the terrible crisis-ridden famine years, which went on for an entire decade of 1846 to 1856, a longer period of duration, if you like, a longer period of difficulty even than the Great Irish Famine of the same time, and the same cause, of course, the failure of the pivotal potato crop due to Phytophthora infestans, the dreaded blight. But we cannot use the Highland factor to explain what happens after the 1850s, 1860s, because by the 1860s, 1870s, gales only made up about 1 in 10 of the permanent exodus, and even less as we move into the 20th century. It is an extraordinary irony, ladies and gentlemen, that the Scottish diaspora of the last century and a half came from the areas of modernity, the areas of modernising tendency within Scotland. They came from the cities, they came from the towns, they came from the rural environments of Scotland, and particularly the villages and farms of the Scottish lowlands. Why? Partly it was opportunity. Scotland, even in its great heyday of industrial expansion, was a grossly unequal society. It was also a society where much of the industrial success was due to low wages. And so clearly the differential between life here and life, or potential life, abroad, especially in North America, South Africa and Australasia, was likely to be felt very keenly in this part of the world. A second thing was the sheer modernisation of Scotland. We know that a very large number of those who left down to the Second World War were skilled or semi-skilled. They had been trained. They had served apprenticeships. Some of them had even gone at the elite level to the Scottish universities of the time. They had been trained and they had evolved as people in, if you like, almost at the cutting edge of what was a very dynamic system of advanced capitalism. These countries to which they went had abundant land, had abundant raw materials, but they lacked that special factor, skilled labour. And that's what Scotland bestowed, and that's why all the evidence suggests, whether it be accountants, bankers, cattle ranchers, shepherds, artisans in the steel mills and the shipbuilding yards of North America and Australasia and South Africa, that the Scot tended always apparently to punch above weight. Not because they were in a sense genetically superior, although some along the road might argue that this was the case, but because they had, as it were, they were coming from this particular advanced society. And before the presiding officer comes down with his gavel, I want to add one final possible explanation for this. Because although you could argue, and it has been argued, that the exodus, the diaspora of the Gael, was produced by force, by circumstances which were unacceptable and people therefore left, I think there is some evidence even in lowland Scotland that you can bring into account the push factor. I've already alluded slightly to it. The maldistribution of the advantages of empire and of industrialism. But the other thing to bear in mind is we cannot avoid stressing the poverty of many Scots in the heyday of empire and Victorian industrialism in the mid to late 19th century into the 20th century. A quarter of Glasgow's population were in conditions of primary poverty. That's poverty which will simply guarantee life and nothing else. 48% of people in Scotland lived in overcrowded conditions, according to the Royal Commission on Housing of 1918, as opposed to 8% in England and Wales. The Scottish Poor Law of the late 19th and early 20th century was notoriously mean, and that meant that the welfare cushion, which we obviously have today, was very limited or non-existent. It's my view, ladies and gentlemen, that many Scots abandoned Scotland, not simply because they sought opportunity overseas, but because the life of that period was not acceptable to them. And that's one of the great developments of the last 20 to 25 years. I've argued that old Scotland, of the type I'm describing, flourished until the 1950s, that the 1950s were actually closer to the Scotland of the 1850s than to the Scotland of 2009. I have also argued in print that over the last 25 years, this nation has experienced a transformation even greater in depth and social extent than the classical industrial revolution, in terms of social structure, gender, economy, identity, and not least in terms of what this chamber means, political systems and aspirations. And if I then want to try and build a bridge between the past and what's going to be discussed in the next few minutes, what I would say is that one of the great challenges for us is to demonstrate to the diaspora, whether long distance or first generation, the scale of that transformation. If many did leave Scotland because there were negative forces operating, then there's been striking and vast improvement. The other thing I would say in terms of the relationship between the past and the future, I would argue that in addition to Michael Russell's long-term plan, the relationship with the diaspora and the diaspora's relationship with Scotia have to be based on credible intellectual foundations, rather than, even if some of those foundations might cause concern, rather than discredited myth and romantic fantasy. Thank you.
I think you can rest assured, Tom, there's no way I would have been bringing a contribution like that to an end with or without a gavel. I really genuinely thank you for that absolutely fascinating keynote speech. You have held everybody here absolutely riveted, and I cannot thank you enough. I now want to move on. You'll have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, a panel sitting in front of us here, and each panellist is going to give us a brief presentation for up to 5 minutes, and I would ask them to stick to that time limit, if I may. I'm always incredibly impressed with speakers who, like Tom, have stood up and managed to deliver their speech in exactly the time that was available to them. I don't often get a chance to say that in this chamber. The first of our panellists that I'd like to introduce is Richard Holloway, probably well known to many of you. He's the former Bishop of Edinburgh. He's the chair of the Scottish Arts Council. He's a very well-known writer and broadcaster. He's written for The Times, The Guardian, The Sunday Herald and The Scotsman. And he's currently guest director of the Edinburgh Book Festival. We're delighted he's with us here today, and I'd invite Richard Holloway to take the podium.
Countermanded, sir, by David Steele.
I bow to my predecessor.
I thought you were introducing them all.
One at a time to make a 5-minute presentation, I believe.
Sorry about that. I thought that we were coming to the panel collectively in a second. We're each invited to say 5 minutes in response to that wonderful address by Tom Devine. I was looking through again his magisterial history of Scotland since the Union, and I wrote down one sentence which struck me. And he said this: as late as the 1790s, London cartoonists continued to lampoon the Scots as treacherous and parasitic mendicants feasting off England's riches both home and abroad. And I thought, nothing much changes, really. Presiding officer, you will have had the same experience, and George Reid as well, as I had during my time as presiding officer, of visiting Caledonian societies, St Andrews societies, Burns clubs all over the world. In my case, from Budapest to Lisbon, from Nairobi to New York. And what struck me in that experience was the fact that the Scots overseas celebrate their Scottishness, celebrate St Andrew's Day in particular, much more than we do at home. And I think this Diaspora Forum is an excellent opportunity to start perhaps to put that right. Now, Tom Devine was talking, he used the word hemorrhage in talking about the emigration from Scotland. And of course, most people concentrate naturally on the Highland clearances. I just want to say that, in fact, of course, there was also considerable hemorrhage from the borders of Scotland, which is my own area. And in particular, and I'm glad that Tom mentioned this in his address just now, that hemorrhage was going on particularly in the period after the Second World War. It wasn't an ancient clearance. During the by-election in 1965, when I was first elected as an MP, one of the great issues which arose there was the discussion of depopulation from the border counties. And the crude figures of depopulation disguised a real hemorrhage in the age group 20 to 45, the working age group. There was a colossal drop in the population in the border area during the decade of the 1950s. And in fact, the local newspapers, right up to the late 60s, I would say, used to have a column, all of them, every week, a list of families named who were emigrating to Canada or Australia or South Africa. It was a commonplace. It was part of the fabric of the area. And it wasn't until government changed the criterion for development area status from the narrow profile of unemployment only. People in the borders didn't sit around waiting to be unemployed. They left. And when that was suddenly realized eventually by government, that depopulation became part of the criterion for establishing development areas, that enabled new industry to come into the area, and the hemorrhage was stopped. So it was a feature of the whole of Scotland and not just one particular area. I think that today's panel, which we've assembled here, and Presiding Officer, I'm going to hand back to you to introduce all of them, and then we will take them one by one in whatever order you so decide, sir. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Sir David. That's what I was about to do anyway. So I will go back. Well, I will introduce all the panellists to you. First of all, we have Richard Holloway on my extreme right on the panel. I've already given you his details, and I will invite him to take the podium in a minute. Our second panellist on Richard's left is Dr. Louise Richardson. She is the Principal and Vice-Chancellor at St Andrews University. She's a political scientist and has spent her career, interestingly, combining research on terrorism with graduate and undergraduate teaching. I'm searching for a link there. And I can only assume that if you understand how to deal with terrorists, you've got half a chance with undergraduates. But she has won numerous teaching awards, and again, we're delighted that she's been able to be with us this morning. Thirdly, we have Dr. Rabinda Butta, who has over 20 years clinical research experience. She's the director and founder of Clintech International and was recently named the Scots Businesswoman of the Year at the Evening Times Scots Women of the Year Awards in 2009. We've already heard from Professor Tom Devine and indeed from the first presiding officer, Sir David Steele. It's a fascinating panel, and perhaps I could ask the three who have not already spoken to give their reaction, perhaps, to the keynote speech, and I would first invite Richard Holloway to do so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer. I don't want to contradict you, but the topic we've been given to discuss is this. We look to Scotland for all our ideas of civilization, a quote from Voltaire. Is Scotland living on the laurels of the past, or can there be a new Scottish Enlightenment? If so, how critical is the Scottish diaspora to achieving this? And I prepared a few remarks in response to that, and not in response to Tom's paper. Okay. Which I much appreciated, nevertheless. And I duly genuflect, as he would expect. I think the first point I would make is that I do not think you can contrive an enlightenment by any device at all, especially a politically contrived enlightenment. So I think we should stop trying to crank up another Scottish enlightenment. If one comes along, we'll welcome it. I think, however, we can understand the conjunction of factors that precede such a catalytic reaction, and we can encourage them. And I want to look very briefly at some of what I think were the conditions of that original Enlightenment, and they're not totally absent today. I think, first of all, you need individuals of genius whose primary loyalty is to their art or to their understanding of truth. I think the corollary of that kind of loyalty is a kind of disloyalty. They're disloyal to everything else except what they perceive to be their art or their truth. They're disloyal to the going religion, the going political settlement, patriotism, conventional ideas. This is why the great novelist Graham Greene said that disloyalty was the primary virtue of the writer, of the artist. The writer, the artist, has to be disloyal to everything except to that compelling vision that gets their art made. And I think that's been a fundamental element in all areas of enlightenment. People just do not feel a kind of reverence for what's happening in the situation in which they find themselves. They doubt it, they challenge it, and they move it on. It's also why Nietzsche said that the greatest danger to stable societies is increasing stupidity, and the thing that moves societies on is disloyalty among what he called the degenerates, the artists, the people who are not interested in the present or the past, but who bring the future into the present. And it's a related fact. I think, apart from this kind of passionate loyalty to an idea, to an ideal, to an art form, I think another element in these galvanic events that we call enlightenments is what geneticists would call hybrid vigor. Most enlightenments come from mongrel peoples, where there's a kind of a mix of ideas, of DNA. Graham Greene loved a couple of lines in the poet Browning. Our interest is on the dangerous edge of things. And most of these great explosions of of new art and creativity have come at that age where people intermingle. And Tom has told us how the Scots have mingled. They've shoved not only their physical DNA, but their spiritual and intellectual DNA everywhere. And they have encountered other kinds of intellectual and spiritual DNA. And that has created these great explosions of art. And I think that the Scottish Enlightenment was an example of that. You can also say that to some extent it was the outworking of the Scottish Reformation, something that a lot of people do not consider to have been totally enlightening. But it did liberate a certain kind of challenging intellectuality, the role of the individual as opposed to the conglomerate religious institution. I think that many of the ideas in the Enlightenment were a working out of that, as well as the rejection of the Reformation. I think I'd also want to suggest that the current exciting mix in Scotland is because the great Roman Catholic presence has reasserted itself in Scotland. So you have a residual Presbyterian DNA, you have a strong Catholic presence, and you have an increasingly ascendant secular presence. And I think this mix of ideas is generating a lot of interest and excitement in Scotland. I think it's also worth pointing out that one of the frontiers that impacted Scotland was England and the Union. And whether you appreciate that or not, it clearly had a chemical effect on Scotland's self-understanding. Let me, in conclusion, offer a few possible ways in which we might reclaim some of this stuff today. I think the Scottish diaspora does suggest the importance of what I've called hybrid vigour, this mix, this mongrelization, and I hope that that continues. The new Scotland is increasingly a plural society. The increasing plurality of Scotland, I think, could inject a new hybrid vigour into the life of the nation now, which is one reason why I think we should have policies that encourage massive immigration into Scotland. We're a largely empty country. I know it's something that we cannot do on our own because we still have a kind of Westminster shackle on some of the things that we can in fact do. But it seems to me that what we should be doing in Scotland is bringing the diaspora home, and not just DNA Scots, but anyone that wants to move here, because I think that will be one of the essential conditions of this new explosion. I think the final point I would make is that what we should be working for is not a Scottish Enlightenment, but a global Enlightenment. It seems to me that one of the great things about Scots at their best is they have been universal. Their art has appealed everywhere. And it seems to me that rather than simply create a new and enlightened Scotland, we should be working through our art, through our politics, through our spirituality, to re-enlighten a world that shows increasing signs of an engulfing darkness.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you also for correcting me. You are, of course, quite right. The topic for discussion for this part of the morning's event is a discussion around the topic of is Scotland living on the laurels of the past, and can there be a new Scottish Enlightenment? If so, how critical is the diaspora to this? So thank you for putting me right on that. Could I now come to our next panellist, Dr. Louise Richardson, who, as I've already said, is Principal and Vice-Chancellor of St Andrews University.
Presiding Officer, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for having me here today. I should say I find it completely impossible to do justice to this subject in 5 minutes, so I'm just going to make a couple of brief points, which will necessarily involve gross generalizations, which I'm sure will offend some of you. The perspective I bring to this subject is twofold. First, as a member of the Irish diaspora in America, and secondly, as an educator. We don't need to rehearse here the similarities between Ireland and Scotland, two small countries in the Celtic fringe with a colourful and checkered historical relationship with its bigger, richer and more powerful neighbour. The Scottish diaspora, as we've heard, has about 14 million people. The Irish diaspora is about twice that size. But the Irish diaspora in the US is, I think you'll agree, both more organised, more self-conscious, more involved with the homeland than the Scottish diaspora is. And the question is why? So I'd like to suggest a couple of reasons why this might be the case. First, I think ironically, because the Scottish were more successful They were made more welcome in America. They integrated well. So they didn't need the support of a national immigrant community as a crutch, as it were. Secondly, and related to this, I think was the motive for emigration by the Irish was somewhat different than the Scottish, and Professor Devine has alluded to this. Scottish migration was driven largely by ambition, whereas Irish emigration was driven largely by desperation. So if ambition is the driver, you tend to integrate much more quickly, whereas if the driver is poverty, a feeling of being coerced into leaving one's homeland, I think you're more likely to try to cling on to what one has left behind, or indeed to cling on to an idealised notion of what one has left behind. And more recent Irish emigrants, like myself, I think are much more like Scottish immigrants historically, driven by ambition, and as a result have tended to mirror the behaviour of Scottish immigrants rather than Irish ones. Third point is timing. Again, Professor Devine alluded to this, but the biggest wave of Irish immigration came in the middle of the 19th century. After Irish society had been very successfully mobilised by Daniel O'Connell in his mass movement for Catholic emancipation, which was based on mobilising the parishes. As a result, when the Irish arrived in America, they were accustomed to political organisation, and they soon used these organisational skills to take over the political hierarchies in cities like Boston, Chicago, and New York. This then tended to reinforce their reliance on this tight sense of community, in a sense retarded their integration. A fourth explanation, I think, is the ongoing troubles in Ireland, which served, again, to reinforce the ties. The iron rule of political interpretation, I believe to be simplicity of interpretation increases with distance from the problem. Finally, I think the organisation of the Scottish diaspora suffered by being perceived as part of the British diaspora. The Anglo-American relationship, the special relationship, as we all know, is probably the most successful alliance, bar none, in the world, and has been for a long time. But precisely because of its strength, because of the cultural affinities and close connections between the political leaderships in both countries, there was less need to develop the kind of lobbying organisations that other immigrant communities in the US had, be they Israelis, Irish, Italians, and so on. So Britain has always managed to exercise, or to punch above his weight, to use a term that was used earlier, exercise more influence than an objective assessment of its capabilities would warrant by virtue of this special relationship. And so, in a sense, again, I think this retarded, from the Scottish point of view, the creation of a more coherent, more unified Scottish diaspora. So, in sum, I think, ironically, it's the relative success of the Irish diaspora has been due to their less successful integration. Although, as I say, recently I think we've had a convergence of trends. Secondly, let me then turn to the question we were asked to address, and I'll do this very quickly. Is Scotland living on the laurels of the past? I have to say that I worry that when it comes to education, we may very well be. Unlike Voltaire himself, for all his kind words about Scotland, Voltaire was not a supporter of mass education. He was distinctly hostile to it. On the other hand, Scotland, historically, as we all know, has had an extraordinary and globally admired commitment to universal education of a high quality. We know that for hundreds of years, 250 years, of the 6 universities on this island, 4 of them were Scottish. We know about the Education Act of 1696, which established locally funded parish schools. We know that literacy rates in Scotland for hundreds of years were the highest in Europe. And it was indeed precisely because of this educated population that the ideas of the Enlightenment could take hold and could then fuel the Industrial Revolution. Our educational institutions today remain very strong. We have a higher participation rate in higher education than England. We remain a magnet for international students. We have at least 60,000 of them studying in Scotland today. But there are disquieting signals. The improvement in GCSE results in our schools, for example, are improving at a much higher rate south of the border than they are here. I mean, how many young people do any of you know who could talk about the Enlightenment today, or could talk about the 2 enormously fascinating political events that serve as the bookmarks to the Enlightenment, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 or the French Revolution of 1789. If we want to maintain our position, much less to improve it, we are going to have to invest in education. This is not, and I repeat, not a criticism of government. Rather, it's a call to society generally, and especially the most educated and the most successful members, to invest in education so that future generations of Scots can have the benefits we have had and recognise and participate and indeed lead the next Enlightenment, or indeed be able to recognise it when it comes. If there is to be a new Enlightenment, I think it is unlikely to be a national one, a Scottish Enlightenment per se, because I think we live in an increasingly globalised world. Rather, I see it, if it comes, as being linked to technology. But with the breathtaking pace of technological change, who is going to step back and think about its implications for society? We've seen in recent weeks fundamental questions about prolonging age of childbearing, for example. We are grappling with questions about the prolongation and soon the replication of life. Who is going to be able to step back and help us grapple with these questions? I think it has to be our universities. I think they will be the bedrock of any future enlightenment, as they have been in the past, but they will require our support. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Richardson. And last but certainly not least, we come to Dr. Rabinder Butta, who, as I said previously, is the director and founder of Clintech International. I'd invite you to give us your thoughts on our topic.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a little bit unusual for me, and you're probably all looking at me thinking, what's a Indian girl doing over here? Well, actually, I've got an Indian background, but I feel very Scottish. I've actually been brought up here, educated at some of the finest universities here in Scotland, and I've lived around 16 years in Germany. And what I felt when I was over in Germany was how attached I was really to Scotland, how much I missed and appreciated really the culture, the values, the things that make Scotland really great. And what I found over there was there were many other people like me. And then what I found over there was also there were Germans, there were Japanese, and there were other people that actually loved Scottish things and came to Burns suppers and joined in Cayleys and all these things. So I think Scotland has a certain identity, and I think it is recognised in many parts of the world. However, apart from all the great things that are recognised out there, people do, in the business world especially, still have a certain perception that Scotland's not a great place to do business. It's not really where you would be looking to put your headquarter company. And this is where I came from. Actually, over 12 years in Germany, I built a business from scratch, an international business. And recently, a couple of years ago, I decided I would take the bold step and bring my business to Scotland and build a global headquarters here. There weren't many companies here with such global headquarters, especially in my specific area of clinical research in the field of bioscience, biotechnology. There aren't really big global businesses here in Scotland. So I thought it was a bit of an enterprise in itself doing this. But I couldn't be more pleased at what I've done, and I tell everyone everywhere in the world this is the best decision I ever made. I acknowledge the fact that there are excellent universities here, and there is a huge willingness in the graduates that are coming out of the universities to learn. Professor Devine, you were talking about people leaving Scotland. They left years ago, but they're leaving today as well. People leave Scotland because they look outside in the world for new opportunities. Some people come back, like I have come back, but why would somebody want to come back? There has to be a reason for them to come back. So what I can say over the last 2 years, you can call it a kind of experiment on which other companies can build their models. Over the last 2 years, I built a nice office here with people that have come out of universities here or had certain skills that we could educate them, we could develop them further, and I really threw them into it. They're all doing global business. My company develops new medicines for the big pharmaceutical companies. We're looking to cure some of the world's most serious diseases. We're working with Glaxo, Novartis, all those big companies. And the people that work for me here, they're dealing with South Africa, North Africa, they call it the Middle East and North Africa region. They're dealing with Latin America, they're dealing with Asia Pacific. I actually have a fantastic world-class operation in India as well. So what I want to say is, and all those people have stayed, there's stability in the company. People are not jumping around like in recruitment companies or others. People are prospering in Clintech. My company has had like 100% growth last year, and it's continued to grow this year. And it's, you know, a finalist in National Business Awards, numerous awards the company's been receiving, and the people really feel proud. So what I want to say is really that Scottish people are great. They can be developed. I would encourage international businesses to be built here in Scotland. I would encourage Scots people abroad to come back to Scotland and do what I did and build a business here. But one thing we must remember is Scotland really should remember Diaspora, really should connect with all different parts of the world. We don't do it enough. When I go a lot with the United Kingdom trade investment groups. I go on all these trade missions to India usually and other places, but it's usually very British. You know, I really miss Scottish colleagues there. We have, at our exhibitions, we have films in Scotland playing. My team wear their kilts, and all the Americans, everyone's attracted to our exhibition stands, and then they hear me speaking my Scottish accent and they're really stunned. So we are doing quite well, but I would really encourage Scottish Development Enterprise and all the groups over here to really make a presence. Every time the United Kingdom trade investment groups are over there, make sure the Scottish are represented as well. I'm only one person, but through the Diaspora and all those other Scots across the world, I think we can all kind of join together through groups like this and try and build global businesses here. This will also alleviate some of the problems and perceptions, poverty and drug abuse, poor conditions, Scotland not a prosperous country. These are all the things I've heard from out there. But if there are prestigious companies like Clintech, of course we are known for our whisky and everything, but if you have prestigious companies in science and technology and all these high-profile areas as well, then I think the whole reputation of Scotland will be greatly increased. And it's the Scottish people, I feel, all over the world have a great responsibility to do this. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Butter, and I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, you will agree that these contributions bode well for the discussion that is now about to take place. Just before I hand back to Sir David, who will facilitate the question and answer session, because this is your turn now to contribute here, can I just say we want everybody to contribute if they want to do so. If I could say to everybody up in the gallery, we have officials with roving microphones. If Sir David catches your eye and calls you to speak, if you could just wait for the microphone to be brought to you and then give your name and who you're representing before you make your point or ask your question. And for those of us down here in the chamber itself, if you could wait until the red light on your microphone is shining before you start to speak. So we have exactly 3/4 of an hour for this part of the session, and I'm delighted to hand over to Sir David Steele to facilitate it for us. Sir David.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. And first of all, let me apologise for the confusion earlier. I thought that I was chairing that you were introducing the whole panel first, and I had already arranged that Dr. Richardson was going to speak first and all the rest of it. So we had a wonderful piece of non-communication. Now it's open to the floor, and I would invite questions, not statements, to the panel. Perhaps I might kick off with a question to Dr. Richardson. I've always been intrigued as to why it is that the Irish diaspora is much more influential than the Scottish diaspora in relation to their homeland. And as you've lived in America and seen it operating, are there lessons that we should learn from that, or is there something fundamentally different?
Thank you. Well, I attempted to suggest some reasons why there might be a difference, but I don't doubt that there's a great deal we can learn. The Irish government has invested a great deal of time and energy, money and resources into cultivating relationships with its diaspora over a protracted period, and has been very successful in securing inward investment and indeed raising money, private philanthropy for private causes in Ireland. So I think, in fact, there is a great deal that can be learned, but my sense of it is that the Scottish Government has actually been doing that and been canvassing studies of other diasporas. There are others beyond the Irish which have been very successful. The prototype tends to be the Israelis.
Tom, do you have...
Yeah, I think Louise Richardson pinpointed historically the fact that there are two fundamental differences, or several fundamental differences between the two ethnicities in terms of emigration. I think that's the root answer to your question, David. But I think in addition to that, you can correct me, Louise, on this, but my sense is that the Irish government only became proactive in this area in the 1970s and 1980s. It's a fairly recent development. And before that, there had been a kind of hiatus between the civil wars of the 1920s and this resurgent interest, not least, of course, tragically, to some extent, triggered and accelerated by the Troubles. But, you know, the Irish government had a much easier task than we have, for the reasons that Louise Richardson has identified. The second thing I would say is, I have met some of the top flight members of the Scottish diaspora, including people like the Forbes family and Trump, etc. And they do have a rather eccentric view of modern Scotland. They see it overwhelmingly, and this is one of the reasons why, when I asked the question, the Irish philanthropy has been a tremendous bonus to the development of modern Ireland, not least in the educational sphere. My chair at Aberdeen University, it was not funded by a Scot. It was funded by an expatriate Irish family, because the chair was in Irish and Scottish studies. So when I asked, if you like, this diasporic elite, one of the continuous complaints is Scotland has to recover its entrepreneurial energies of the 19th and early 20th century, because it is a society which is over-dependent on the state. So we're dealing here not simply with some of the other complexities, but with powerful ideological obstacles, David. And I think we've got to remember that these exist and how we respond to them. And we don't necessarily have to respond to them enthusiastically.
Thank you. Right. There were two people who wrote in questions, so if they wave their hands at me, I will try and call them. But anybody who wishes to ask a question of the panel, please just indicate, and I'll call you. There's a hand right up in the gallery there. If the microphone can... Yep, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Anne Johnson. I'm currently in Edinburgh, have been living in Los Altos in California for the last 15 years, emigrated from Aberdeenshire to England in 1981. So I guess I'm the classic target market for this particular event. My question is, why do I have to pick between Scotland and somewhere else? The ideal life arrangement for me would be one where I can spend some significant number of months in Scotland, some significant number of months in California, and to operate a business in both places, I want to be a citizen of both and to have a tax environment which is conducive to doing that. Consider the model, I would like the whole panel to consider the model, where citizenship evolves beyond a single country. Your comments would be appreciated.
Let me put that to Dr. Butter, because she has more experience, perhaps, of being almost dual citizenship.
The question is, why pick Scotland? Or can you repeat that?
Just pull the microphone a bit towards you.
The question is, why pick? Why not be able to be a joint citizen of the world? It's a different model, not a single citizen model, single state citizen model.
So your question is more, why do you have to be, you have an affinity to the country you're living in and Scotland as well, so why not sort of have dual citizenship, right? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Right?
Not just dual citizenship,
yeah.
A model of living that isn't specific to a particular country. My proposal is that we evolve a model for global citizens, of whom there are a significant number,
yeah.
and that is somewhat opposed to the model that's being discussed here so far of people who are either gone or here.
I can understand you. I ask myself that sometimes as well. I love many countries. I love Scotland, and obviously I've lived in Germany many years, have an affinity to India. And why can't we just acknowledge that we're more global now, and we don't really have to have a root in one place? So I can understand that, and I think as people become more international and they travel more, they will have affinity to a lot more places, and I think I think people will still retain their Scottish or their Indian, etc. identity, but will be kind of international Scots or international Indians, and I think that really is the way forward.
Louise, did you want to add anything on that?
Well, I would have thought it is actually possible to lead that kind of lifestyle. I think I try to. I was conscious of using the term we when speaking about Scotland this morning. People in Ireland get a little disconcerted when I use the term we speaking about Ireland. People in America get a little disconcerted when I use the term we speaking about America. I don't see these things as mutually exclusive. I take your point about a tax regime which would facilitate this kind of living, but I wouldn't be optimistic that one could, we could create one.
I should add here, I'm actually a resident of Dubai as well, United Arab Emirates. I'm really fond of that country.
Right,
can I come in just?
Yes,
I mean, I respond very warmly to that. It does run counter to the kind of nationalistic element that's also one of the complicating factors in world politics at the moment. I mean, I quite like this idea of a kind of a world passport. But we're also very defensive about our borders for all sorts of reasons. My wife's an American. She has a British and an American passport. They won't give me an American passport. I'd quite like to have one. It would make it easier getting through immigration and having to strip naked. Yeah.
Right, there was a hand right up at the back row there, if the microphone can reach her. Anybody from the floor? Yes, well, let's take the gentleman here first, while the microphone's going up there.
I am Chris van der Kuyl. I'm the Chief Executive of a Scottish technology company called Bright Solid. My question to the panel is really about the massive increase in interest in family history and family history research because of the facilities that have been made available through the internet, specifically in Scotland, the government Scotland's People website and centre. This seems to have had a huge impact on people being interested in their roots, in tracing their roots, in their genealogical, and has sort of raised a genealogical passion amongst a lot of people. And I wonder, and possibly specifically Professor Devine to comment, if one is seeing an interest in diasporic issues and some of the themes that we're talking today being driven by the technological revolution that kind of provides the engine for people to really understand where they come from and how they relate to different nationalities.
Who'd like to pick that up?
Tom? Well, it's absolutely true what you're saying, and it's not restricted to this nation either. Apparently, the family history activity is now the #1 hobby or recreation in the UK as a whole, and it's almost certainly the case worldwide. And it's a curious phenomenon because it goes back to this issue of globalisation. It seems to me what's been happening over the last 20 to 30 years is as globalisation has kicked in to a really enormous extent, almost as we've seen in the banking crisis, uncontrollable extent, it has not evaporated local differences or diversity. Ironically enough, it may well have encouraged it. And the tumultuous changes which we've experienced, again worldwide, since the Second World War, but more importantly over the last quartile of the century, or more significantly rather over the last quartile of the century, in periods of that kind of unprecedented social change, people tend to, I think nostalgic is a bit too slick a word, but they tend to look back and they're looking for anchors. So you're absolutely right about the reality of what you mentioned. And it is rather interesting that nobody so far has emphasised the critical role that the new technology you describe can make in terms of connections with the emigrations, with the diaspora worldwide. This is a completely new phenomenon, and I know that there are public agencies working very effectively with it. The only thing I would say about family history in terms of a critique is one of the great dangers in small nation history, especially if you're living with an elephant, as we have been certainly in a political sense since 1603 and from 1707, that there tends to be strong possibilities, maybe even probabilities for ethnic conceit and chauvinism and triumphalism, and above all that terrible academic sin, exceptionalism. And I think, to some extent, there is perhaps a personal egotism or egoism about the family history mania, which is useful because that encourages the commitment to it. But as a professional historian, especially somebody who wants to sell books, I would like to see that personal interest contextualised, so that through the if you like, the portal of family history, we can, or people interested in that, can gain a greater understanding of their past, which means a greater understanding of the way they came to be the way they are. And in a society like ours, where our past is so myth-laden, and where the population, as I was saying to Louise Richardson earlier on, not through any fault of their own, is historically mainly illiterate because of the grave inadequacies of teaching of the nation's past and culture in our schools, currently being addressed, I may say, by the present government, and that's good. But the committee they have appointed to do this, of which I happen to be a passive member, i.e. I don't very often attend, so I'm as guilty as anybody else, that it reminds me of Harold Wilson's famous comment about royal commissions. They take years, they spend years taking minutes. So what I want to see quite soon from Michael and his colleagues is some trenchant intervention in this national educational scandal.
Right. Anybody else on the panel? Should we go to the gentleman at the back?
Yes, my name is David Mackay, and I'm a Scottish Canadian who has now retired to live in Edinburgh. And thank you, Lord Teal, for recognising me way up at the top. I believe you might remember me from Vancouver when you came out to address the Scottish Institute a year and a half or so ago of Simon Fraser University. And I'm very interested in I'm an internationalist, but I'm also a nationalist. And one main reason that I'm now residing in Scotland is because I wish, as a Scot, to fully take part in the unfolding political developments, including any vote in a possible referendum.
Can you speak into the microphone? Don't
yes, sorry. And so I was very interested in the first question because I have two citizenships, but perhaps I don't have the one I really want, which is Scottish citizenship. But I note that the Calman Commission has just come down with a recommendation that the Scottish Parliament have the right itself, and not to do with Westminster, to develop its own rules around elections. And I would really encourage that, if that is to happen, that Scottish people abroad who are citizens of Great Britain and whose, like myself, whose parents were born here and who have this citizenship for that reason, in other words, the two generations only, not everyone, unfortunately, would have the right and would be considered by the Scottish Parliament to have the right to vote from abroad. There are many, many countries in the world where this is allowed. Britain lets its people vote for 15 years after they immigrate and then terminates it. And second-generation citizens of Britain, like myself, have no rights to vote from abroad. Now, I'm here, but I want the Scottish Parliament to seize this opportunity that the Calman Commission is providing it to enlarge the concept of citizenship and voting rights. And I'd love to hear what the SNP in particular would say about this.
Thank you very much. We've got the point. I almost feel I should ask the presiding officer to answer that one, but will anyone in the panel like to have a crack at that? Not a bad idea.
I think it is a bad idea.
A bad idea.
Yeah. I think to have people not actually actively involved in the economics, the sociology, the difficulties of a culture, and to vote, as it were, romantically from outside. I mean, it's almost as bad as some of the disparities in the way Scottish politicians can vote on English policies, which is a difficulty we haven't resolved. The famous West Lothian question. This would be the Vancouver question, even worse.
Okay. Let's take the gentleman here, and I see some other hands going up. Yep. This one here. Yep.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Wolfgang Mössinger. I'm the German Consul General in Edinburgh, covering Scotland and part of Northern England, by the way. Part of this discussion here about the diaspora is, of course, also engaging in an international context, Scotland looking outwards to the world. Would the panel share my worry that this engagement is increasingly hampered by a very considerable decline in learning and teaching of foreign languages in this country?
Who'd like to have a crack at that? Louise?
Well, I share your concern, of course. And I'm sure we'd agree that we would love to see more funding of languages, both in the primary schools and actually it's held constant at university level. But if you look around the United Kingdom, you'll see that increasingly, and indeed in Scotland, it's been considered, language departments are being closed because it's expensive to teach languages, and we require a greater investment of resources in which to do it. But then, as you look lower, or to more junior students, they are not investing in education, not spending the time to learn languages as we all wish they would. I agree, there's no better way to get a sense, an outside sense on your own society than speaking a different language, or a keener appreciation of other societies than learning theirs. So I agree.
I would just like to add there, I have children. Their first language is actually German. And I know the feeling and the problem of coming back here, and it's very hard for them to keep up their German, even in the best of schools here. But what I want to really say is it is a problem. When I was abroad, the one thing that was different from the people in Britain and everyone else was the fact that we didn't speak so many languages. We spoke English and we were quite happy with English, but our colleagues in continental Europe, for example, spoke several languages. I think as we globalise, become international, we really need to make sure that in our schools here that languages play an important part.
Thank you. I'll go to the lady at the back here. Yes.
I'm Valerie Smith, and I'm President of the Scottish Australian Heritage Council in Australia, naturally. I rather take exception to this idea that the diaspora is romantic and that we have romantic ideas about Scotland. We have to remember that when the clearances, and I'm a fifth-generation Australian, so my ancestry is that of the Highland Immigration Scheme, which was a very convenient scheme which made the Highlanders ship out to Australia in their thousands, and naturally they landed there and they became our first pioneers. So there was nothing romantic about their ideas of the land they left. It was cold, hard reality, which they did pass on to us. There was a question asked yesterday here at the forum, and it was, would Scottish children be able to access Register House and family history easier than they can at the moment? And would it be something that government or other bodies would consider allowing this to happen? And I could have almost cheered, but the question was not answered. And the reason that this is important is that we, from the early 1800s, have probably kept very accurate records of those who came out to Australia. And the moment we get back to the shipping lists, of course, we can't reconnect them into Scotland. We have no idea who this David Cameron, who married Mary Cameron, was out of the thousands of David Camerons and Mary Camerons who got married and were shipped out to Australia. So the moment the young Scots start to do their family history, the less myth there will be about what happened in Scotland. And when we bring Scottish guests out as our guests for Scottish Heritage Week in Australia, we won't have the comment when we do have them attend these various functions, well, of course, we don't do that in Scotland any longer. Now, I no longer take that as a criticism of us. I do take that as a criticism of Scotland, that the celebration of being Scottish is something that you should develop again. There is no harm in being proud and being colourful and a little bit creative as well.
Okay. Tom?
There's several things there. I'll just comment on one or two of them. First of all, the reference to maybe made during our discussions to the romantic attitude is really basically not the experience of people who went out, because first-generation immigrants in particular, whatever background they come from, are emphatically non-romantic. It's the romanticisation that occurs over time. But the second thing is about Scottish awareness. We can actually track this now, statistically, through the energies of our psephologists. And we know that over the last 25 to 30 years, the sense of Scottish identity, especially in terms of the relationship between sense of Scottishness, sense of Britishness, the sense of Scottish identity has, despite what the Speaker says, massively increased. This building is both a result of that increase in Scottish identity, particularly from the 1980s, and itself a catalytic force for further deepening that identity. One of the problems that may be occurring here is that the way Indigenous Scots see their identity, the indicators of that identity, the markers of that identity, may be somewhat different from elements within the global, and I would particularly think the North American diaspora, because I think one of the major challenges for government policy in this area is that there is such a thing as North American Scottish or American Scottish identity, and the markers that go into that, which we'll see unambiguously across the road today and tonight. And some of that does jar. Let's be honest with it. Let's be honest about it. Some of that manifestation of identity does jar with certain Indigenous Scots. The other thing we've got to remember is the Willie McIlvanney point. We are a mongrel nation. My own reckoning is that about 1 million or slightly more of our current 5 million population are the descendants of Catholic and Protestant Irish And at the last census of 2001, there were 420,000 first-generation English people in that. Richard talked eloquently about pluralisation, and that is absolutely right, but there's got to be also pluralisation of identity within Scotia itself.
We should also think, should we not, of the links between Scotland and Europe, which were much closer historically, as you mentioned. For example, the Adam family, we boast about the new town, and this is a very Scottish thing, but of course the Adam family lived in Europe for a long time, and their architecture was influenced by their experience in Europe.
Well, I think just one footnote to that, David, that of all peoples, who other than the Scots and a few other ethnicities are equipped historically to deal with the age of globalisation?
Yep.
Because they have been a truly European people, a transatlantic people, an imperial people. They've been all over the place.
Exactly.
And that should fit them up for the future.
Let's go to the gentleman at the back, and then we'll take one at the front here as well.
Good morning. My name is Alan Bain. I'm President Emeritus of the American Scottish Foundation, and my question is for Dr. Butter. You have done business in both Germany and in Scotland. Do you feel that your business could have been as effective as it obviously is if you had started it in Scotland as opposed to Germany?
You know, that's a really hard question to answer. I think part of the success of the business, you could say, is due to the location, but I think the majority of the success of any business is due to maybe the individual themselves and their ideas and what their whole business is all about and the market they're looking at. So while I would say that a person, wherever they are in the world, can create interesting and good businesses. It's just a degree of difficulty. I actually found it personally extremely difficult in Germany because I lived in a tiny little German town, Dienstlaken. Now, I'm glad every one of you will hear of the word Dienstlaken. It's near Düsseldorf. That's the nearest place. So there were hardly any English-speaking people there. I couldn't find secretaries and all the kind of administrative support that you would need. I started the business from home and then into a little office in Dienstlaken, then moved to Duisburg, a bigger town, till one day Scottish Enterprise actually said, "Rupinder, what are you doing in Duisburg? Why don't you go to Düsseldorf?" And I thought, yeah, I will move to Düsseldorf. That helped a little bit. It is hard. There's the language barrier. And the culture difference. So I suppose if I was here, and I know that the day I arrived here, I was welcomed by Scotland. I was with Jim Mather and myself and our other director were invited for tea in the Scottish Parliament, and it was a big announcement. We got a Scottish grant and we could start here. So I think being in your homeland does have a lot of advantages. But I think at the end of the day, it's up to the individual, the entrepreneur, to be successful wherever they are in the world. We can all acknowledge there are some prosperous businesses here and not so prosperous businesses, as well as some of the greatest economical businesses are there in Germany as well. So I think it's up to the individual.
Thank you. James Hunter.
Thanks very much. I get my 4 minutes later, so maybe I shouldn't be asking a question at all, but I want to draw Tom out a little bit on something he said, particularly in relation to Donald Trump and Mr. Forbes, I think was the other person he mentioned. And like Tom, I've gone about a bit amongst the diaspora, and I've lost count of the times that I've been told that everybody in Scotland who had any get up and go got up and went, and that every enterprising Scot long ago emigrated. I kind of tend now to respond to this by saying, well, where does this leave me? And sometimes I get the kind of acknowledgement that maybe I'm the exception that proves the rule, but that the rule nevertheless holds. And Tom said interestingly that we should perhaps not be afraid to challenge this thinking, which I think is actually quite pervasive in some quite influential quarters overseas. And I just wonder how he thinks we should challenge it.
Well, I think, Jim, when you meet it, truculence. That's, you know, when you meet it, personally identify and try to, in the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment, reasoned, careful, sensible exposition without raising one's voice. This whole subject area, Jim, but on both sides, both ourselves and the people out there, the centuries of immigrants, is beset, and I don't mean this to sound elitist, is beset with ignorance. And I think the only thing that can be done, because as you say rightly, these voices that you define are very influential. We're not necessarily talking about, if you like, the rank and file member of the diaspora. We're talking about people who can actually move millions of pounds in terms of inward investment, who can actually indulge in large-scale philanthropy. I don't know, maybe we should organise a seminar within closed doors and not allow them out in New York City and try to explain the nature of what I think now, and you could argue that some of their argument, some of their analysis was correct for the period from about 1914 through to the 1950s, 1960s. But I truly believe, in terms of the historical conspectus, that we are living in a very vibrant society at this stage. And therefore, it's a platitude, but I think we just have to try and get the message across, either both personally, through genteel truculence, or alternatively, through the profile raising, which I know the Scottish Government is trying to do, about educating people about modern Scotland, as well as, of course, about the historical experience.
Thank you. I'm going to go right up to the far side of the gallery there. I saw a hand waving, and then in the middle, and then up to this side.
Good morning. I suppose I'm your classic mongrel Scot. My name's Martin Stepik. I'm Chief Executive of the Scottish Family Business Association. My dad's Polish, and my mother, though Scots-born, was from a family that came over from the Irish famines. Maiden name's Murphy, so it's probably as un-Scottish a background as you can get and have this accent. A group of us together, I want to ask a very practical question and the panel's advice or thoughts. A group of us have got together to create what we're calling Scottish-Polish synergy, to try and help Scots and Poles do business together and collaborate in business together, to extend that to culture, to the arts, and to get the academics, the universities, to start collaborating much more together between these two countries of my parents' birth. And the motive from my perspective in starting this theme is my grandmother, my Polish grandmother, died of starvation when they were removed to the gulags in the Soviet Union. And obviously my mother's family came from the Irish famines. And I think the idea behind it for me is to try and draw both countries upwards in terms of employment, engagement, intellectual and artistic interests. And I would like, because the four panel members and yourself, Sir David, come from the areas which we think can really make a difference, which is business, politics, culture, arts, academia. So I'd like your perspective on how best you guys can help in your fields to make this sort of thing happen for ourselves, Scotland and Poland, and our organisation on the one hand, and for other people who I suspect will similarly do the same between connecting countries in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard, would you like to have a response to that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I got the question, actually.
I don't think there was a question. It was...
Yeah, there was specifically. I mean, in your role as chair of the Scottish Arts Council, for example, how can the Scottish Arts Council help an organisation such as ours help Scots promote their art in Poland, Poles promote their art in Scotland, and collaborations between the two, similarly for academia, for business, etc.
All right. Chairman of the Arts Council.
Yeah. We do have an international policy, and increasingly art knows no frontiers anyway. I mean, most artists are happy to work abroad. One of the difficulties Scotland feels at the moment is that a lot of our best artists make it abroad because they don't make it to quite the same extent here. I think I can only give you bureaucratic answers. The government itself sees the international dimension of this as very important. It's going to be a fundamental part of the whole understanding of Creative Scotland, that you can't just do art nationally. The thing itself suggests universality. The International Book Festival happens in a couple of weeks. We bring 750 authors from all over to Edinburgh, and we are trying to export more and more of that. There is an Expo Fund, and it may be, sir, that you should come into the Arts Council, and presumably you're after a little bit of money as well as a bit of advice and motivation, and there are various funds that good ideas can be attracted to, and the government has an Expo Fund which is precisely aimed at the kind of thing you're talking about, how to make known something that's happening here abroad and bring something from Poland back here. So I think maybe what you need to do is to come in and find your way around the cartography of the various grant systems and stimulus systems that there are, because it does take a little bit of guidance. We're trying to simplify it, but it's a bit like a kind of railway timetable at the moment.
Right, lady here, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jane Carmichael and I'm Director of Collections at the National Museums of Scotland. But my question has nothing to do with museums. My question is to do with education. And we've heard the Scottish system of education greatly praised as one of the proud traditions of Scotland. But I would like to ask, is it actually right for today's age? Because the primary and the secondary system actually encourages Scottish children overwhelmingly to go to Scottish universities. In a sense, it's limiting their choices. Shouldn't we allow our 17 and 18-year-olds a wider choice of places to go, simply so they have a wider choice? And that way, that would perhaps take us back to the traditions that Tom Devine referred to, the internationalism of education and the results that that brought in Scotland. So my question to the panel is, should we be brave and tackle Scottish education and bring it more into line so that our 17 and 18-year-olds have more choices of places to study?
Now, Dr. Richardson presides over a university with a very large non-Scottish population, so let's ask her.
Well, your question is actually about the Scots going elsewhere,
Yes.
and I think what you're describing is not that students are being retarded. In fact, if what you say is correct, then the people Mr. Hunter has been talking to are actually right, that Scots are not entrepreneurial enough. There is no reason a 17 or 18-year-old can't go to school, university, any place in the world. I think one of the reasons that's holding them back, if you like, from doing so is, perversely, the generosity of the Scottish government in making university education free. You won't find that in any other country. And so that might be a reason, one of many reasons why one might question the wisdom of that approach. If a kid can go to school for free here, they're less likely to go to America, where they will, in a private institution, spend $50,000 a year, which is what, over £30,000 a year in tuition. So I think it's not that the teachers are constraining their ambitions, it's the way we fund education in this country. If at the risk of being rude, I could use that to go back to Mr. Hunter's question, because I would actually have given a very different response than Professor Devine did to you. I actually don't think the Trumps and the Forbes of this world their views on Scotland are determined by the historical views. I think these are hard-headed businessmen who are looking at the Scotland of today, and if they're telling you they're seeing something here, my first reaction would be to listen, not to tell them how wrong they are. I think speaking to education, one of the enormous virtues of education in this country is the ethos of egalitarianism, the fact that there are no fees for universities in Scotland. That is an extraordinary ideal that could be trumpeted worldwide, but it does have costs, and it has the costs we're trying to see. So when you engage in debates with these people, I think the argument is not to tell them they're wrong, but saying we do it differently. In Scotland, egalitarianism trumps other principles, and then have the debate as to whether or not it ought to.
Well, I would say that egalitarianism is another myth as well. But on the issue of the the question that was asked from the National Museums of Scotland. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that most West of Scotland Scots went to Glasgow University and went to Strathclyde University. At least we've actually moved on a bit since then. And Louise Richardson is obviously right that there are advantages in home Scots going to Scottish universities, but there are two qualifications that might be put in there as a more positive emphasis. The first is that we do attract a very large number of international students, and certainly in my school, the School of History, Classics and Archaeology, in the University of Edinburgh, we do try and make significant attempts to encourage interrelationships between those international students and our Scottish students. But the other thing, of course, is that I've noticed a great tendency on the part of some of our own students to go abroad either in Year 2 or Year 3, either on an Erasmus exchange or a North American exchange. It's still a minority, of course, but it does mean that even if you go to a Scottish university, you can still have a degree of international experience. And the other thing is, and you can see it also at the University of St Andrews and certainly in my own university, the teaching staff of Scottish universities is incredibly international. Yeah. And that's a very important input into the whole educational experience.
I'm afraid we have only time for one very brief question from over here, right?
Thank you very much. My name is Eddie Tate. I'm the founder of Scots in London and also the founder of scotsin.com. I would just like to say this conference has been fantastic, so thank you very much for setting it up. Looking with interest at all the questions, my questions to the panel on the dark number, the Scots in England and the Scots in London. My group is a Scottish networking group which was created through Scots in London getting together for social occasions and more recently for business occasions as well. Of the 2,000 people who are registered on our website and the thousands more who are on our mailing list, it's always interesting to hear their views on Scotland and issues. And over the last 3 years, we have built up a considerable amount of research material, information, and all the types of things that the Scottish Diaspora report is mentioning, and indeed we're grateful that we're mentioned as a model network here. But the support given by the Scottish Government has been great in terms of using copy to promote Scotland on our website. The support from Global Scot Network has been great in terms of opening up more Scots to us.
What's your question to the panel?
Yeah, I'm basically, sorry, I'm keen to see their views on looking not just to North America, Canada and Australia, but looking more close to home. Should we be looking at the Scots in London and England first, and then getting more information in the press about Scotland and the domestic scene that is positive, as opposed to things that are maybe more further afield?
Well, there's a voice from the diaspora in London. Any thoughts from the panel on that? No, you've struck them dumb, I think. But I live among them and I sympathise with... there's a huge range of Scottish activities in London. I mean, enormous ones. I think every university has a branch of alumnus activities in London, so it's certainly not neglected. Now, we have run out of time, and I'm going to hand the session back to the presiding officer. Thank the panel very much indeed.
Well, thank you also, Sir David. I did say at the start of the morning's event that this forum would be as good as you could make it. And I think this last question and answer session has proved just how good you are making it. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, some really interesting topics raised and some challenging points put as well. Can I just ask you to join me again in thanking everybody who's taken part in the panel and our keynote speakers this morning in their traditional manner. They've done a wonderful job and we should thank them for having done so. We're now going to have a half-hour refreshment break, and I do mean half an hour. I would ask you to be back in your seats by 11:45. If delegates on the floor would leave by the exit door on my left, they will be shown to the members' restaurant for refreshments, and if members in the gallery would leave by the exit on the right, they will be shown to a different venue, but the same refreshments. I have to take my leave of you at this point, and the second half of the morning will be chaired by my Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just say what a privilege it's been for us here in the Parliament to have you. Thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.